The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Good evening and welcome to the third DuBridge Distinguished Lecture. I'm David Baltimore, the president of Caltech. The DuBridge Distinguished Lecture Series was established in 1996 as a memorial to the late Lee 1946-1969 and science advisor to President Nixon. DuBridge was once dubbed by Time magazine America's senior statesman of science and was considered an exemplary research university president in an era of vast scientific, societal, and educational change. The aim of this namesake lecture series is to bring to our campus speakers of national and international prominence. And so far, we've succeeded admirably. The first DuBridge lecture was the legendary journalist Walter Cronkite. The second, the equally legendary financier Warren Buffett. And now the third DuBridge program has been underwritten for us by the Los Angeles Times, the Ritz-Carlton Huntington, Fidelity Investments, and Aer Lingus, and we're grateful for their support. Tonight, we're privileged to present a conversation with Nobel laureate John Hume, who was awarded the 1998 Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, in recognition of his tireless efforts to resolve the troubles in Northern Ireland. I'm going to defer the formal introduction of John to his countryman and my colleague, Chris Brennan, who's a Caltech professor of mechanical engineering and our vice president for student affairs. But before I do that, I want to first acknowledge Pat Hume, John's wife, who is our honored guest tonight. Pat, could you stand up and... And my official duty tonight is to introduce to you the other participant in tonight's conversation, Kevin Cullen. Kevin is not a native Irishman. He was born in Boston, but he has extensive knowledge and experience of Irish life, history, and politics. In fact, he's been praised by the Irish Times as the most informed American journalist on Irish affairs, and by the British newspaper The Independent as the most astute observer of Irish affairs in the American media. In his student days, he attended Trinity College Dublin for a year, has traveled extensively in Northern Ireland regularly since 1987, reporting on the conflict there. He's been a reporter for the Boston Globe since 1985 and served as the Boston Globe's European correspondent, chief of its bureaus in Dublin and London from 1997 until last summer when he came home to Boston. Kevin's professional achievements have garnered him a number of honors, including regional awards from the Associated Press, the United Press International, the 1988 Livingston Award for his journalistic portrait of a Boston hoodlum, and a 1995 Citation of Excellence from the Overseas Press Club of America for his coverage of Northern Ireland. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kevin Cullen.
Thank you, David.
Nice to see you.
God bless you.
Have a seat, and I'll just be a minimum. Before I turn the podium over to Chris Brennan, let me just mention there will be a question and answer period at the end of tonight's conversation between John and Kevin. We invite you to jot down your questions on cards that were given to you when you came into the auditorium. They will be collected toward the end of the program, and a number will be asked of the gentleman. And so now, to introduce John Hume, Professor Chris Brennan.
Thank you, David. What a fantastic night. In the words of one of my favorite Irish poets, Patrick Kavanagh, there's a dance in Billy Brennan's barn tonight, and there's a half-talk code of mysteries, and the wink and elbow language of delight. For me, it's a true delight and a privilege to introduce the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize winner, John Hume. Let me take a moment to express why. I grew up in a quiet backwater of the world, a small county in northwestern corner of Ireland, County Derry on the map, Derry to those that live there. It's an area of 800 square miles and a population of about 230,000, just over twice the population of Pasadena. And yet, in the past 5 years, that quiet backwater has produced 2 Nobel Prize winners, one a poet and the other a peacemaker. Now, you might say that Nobel Prizes are a dime a dozen around here. And that's true. But it was with enormous pride that I helped to welcome the poet Seamus Heaney to Caltech just 2 years ago. And today it was with even greater pride that I welcome the peacemaker. John Hume was born into the divided city of Derry in 1937 and has struggled all his life to resolve the dysfunctional aspects of that city and the society of Northern Ireland. He was a co-founder of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, the party he helped to create to provide a political alternative to violent confrontation. He has been a member of most of the elected bodies in Northern Ireland, and since 1979, a member of the European Parliament. Indeed, the European perspective is important to John, for in the example of the modern peace between Germany and France, he saw hope for the reconciliation of ancient conflicts. From this side of the Atlantic, John learned of the value of non-violence from the teachings and example of Martin Luther King. But the essence of John Hume did not come from the outside. It came from within his own heart and soul. And that inner strength made him one of the true heroes of our time, in my estimation. When others were reaching for the weapons of death and war, John Hume was stretching for words of reconciliation. In the terrible days, both before and after Bloody Sunday in January of 1972, the day when the British Army fired on civilians in the streets of Derry, John found himself struggling amid tear gas and rubber bullets to try to bring both sides back to the talking table. In that crucible was born a man of courage and commitment who somehow found the strength and resolve over the decades which followed to create a peace in Northern Ireland where few could have hoped it was possible. He saw rabid unionists and fanatical Republicans alike, not as enemies but as political opponents, and somehow managed to forge a middle ground. He is indeed the peacemaker, can truly be counted among those who have created peace from the rubble of tribal violence. In this regard, he ranks with Gandhi and with King, and like them, he walked past violence to get there. It is therefore with enormous pride and great admiration that I welcome to Caltech a man who, for me and for generations of Ulster folk, will simply be known as the peacemaker. Ladies and gentlemen, John Hume.
All the best.
With all these lights, I can't see.
I know. Just as well. I just want to state for the record, this is the only time you'll find the Boston Globe to the left of John Hume. It's somewhat fitting that mostly lost.
So you think I'm right?
I didn't say that. Ask Pat. It's somewhat fitting that mostly lost in the ashes of the World Trade Center, was, at least in America, was the news that John stepped down as the leader of the SDLP. He's still politically involved and will remain so in the European Parliament and the British Parliament and in Irish affairs in general. But it was sort of overshadowed by what happened on September 11th. But that's sort of appropriate in some ways because John Hume's life has often been overshadowed by terrorism, and that terrorists have often, over the last 30 years in Ireland, have dominated the agenda. But John Hume is always there, and when the smoke clears, when the ashes are removed, John is there. And to borrow a line from Gerry Adams, he hasn't gone away, you know. So, John, in talking about Ireland, we could go back 800 years, we could go back 300 or 400 years, but I'd prefer to go back 60-odd years to Derry, where you were born and raised. And you grew up in a generation where it was much easier, in some respects, much more understandable to pick up a gun, to pick up a rock, to pick up something, and you didn't. You decided to take a different path, and I'm wondering what happened, why you chose a different path. What was it in Derry? What was it about your upbringing? What was it about your family that made you go a different road?
Well, I grew up in a community, and the community that I grew up in was very heavily discriminated against. In my city, which is the second city of Northern Ireland, 70% of the population was Catholic, 30% was Protestant. But before I begin, let me make it clear that the quarrel in Northern Ireland isn't a religious quarrel. The Protestant people regard themselves as British, and the Catholic people regard themselves as Irish. So it was much more a quarrel of nationality. But we were 70%, our people were 70% of the population. And the Unionists, the Protestant people, were 30%, yet they governed the city. How did they do it? Because they controlled Northern Ireland as a whole. In the second city, they divided into 3 electoral areas. And in one area, there was 70% of the population, Catholics, who elected 8 councillors. The other 2 areas were 30%, but each elected 6. So the 30% always won every election 12-8. And they maintained their power by discriminating in housing in particular, because local government in those days controlled housing and jobs. So unemployment was central to growing up. My father was unemployed. I was the eldest of 7 children. My father was a very, very intelligent man, because when I was a child, I'd be sitting at the wooden table in our house doing my homework. My father would be sitting at the same table, because we could only have one table, writing letters for all of the people of the district who would come in, because he was a superb handwriter. So from I was no age, the problems of ordinary people was normality. And I was one of the lucky ones. When I got to a certain age, it was the first year of scholarships, and I got one. So I got educated. And then I got a university scholarship. And when I came back with a degree, I felt I had a duty to help those that weren't as lucky as I was. But I didn't want politics. Because the politics in those days were about flag waving, the Irish flag versus the British flag. And I'll never forget my first political lesson when I was 10 years old from my father. I went to an election meeting. In those days, election meetings were at the top of the street in the open air, and they were waving the flags. The Nationalist Party was waving there. I was getting emotional like everybody else. My father put his hand on my shoulder and says, "Never you get involved in that stuff, son." I says, "Why not, Dad?" He says, "You can't eat a flag." But I learned the wisdom of that in our country, political parties used national flags as their political emblem. And when you think of it, a national flag is supposed to represent the unity of the people. And if a political party uses it as a party political, they're dividing. And particularly in Northern Ireland, when those using the Irish flag are standing for Irish unity, all they're doing is driving the Unionist people and the Protestant people further apart. So as I say, that's where I come out of. But when I came back from university, I didn't get into that sort of politics. I got into helping people who were suffering from discrimination. And my line was, "Look, boys, cut out the politics. Our heads and hands are as good as theirs. So let's use them. Theirs being the people who are discriminated against us. So I got involved in the foundation, once again, help from America, of the credit union movement in my city to help ordinary people. And that movement today is huge right across, not only Northern Ireland, but across Ireland. And then we did the same in housing, leaving it out of politics. We'll build our own houses. We don't need politicians to give them to us. So I set up a non-profit housing association. In the first year, we housed 100 families. Then I put in a plan for 700 houses. But the local city council wouldn't give me planning permission because it would have upset the voting balance. And that led me straight into civil rights in 1968 when Martin Luther King was doing the same over here. And that battle for equality led me straight into politics. But throughout, my basic philosophy was revenge is not a solution. Equality of treatment for both sections, because the basic mentality of the Unionist people, the Protestant people, because they were a minority in Ireland, was in what I called an Afrikaner mindset. They wanted to protect their identity, and I think they're totally entitled to protect their identity, because every society is richer for diversity. It was their methods I quarreled with. Their methods was to hold all power in their own hands. If you weren't a Protestant or a Unionist in Northern Ireland, you didn't get a job or you didn't get a house. And unless you paid rates, you didn't get a vote. The votes, for example, if you owned a limited company, business company, each company had 6 votes. And the mayor of Derry, when I was a child, had 43 votes because he owned 7 companies. 7 sixes are 42 plus 1 his own vote. But as I say, my argument was that because of your geography and your numbers, the problem can't be solved without you. Therefore, come to the table and make an agreement that will protect your identity forever.
John.
And to the nationalist community, my own community, I said, you've got a territorial mindset. Ireland is our land, and you Unionists and Protestants are a minority and you can't stop us uniting. My challenge to that mindset was, look, it's people that have rights, not territory. Without people, even Ireland is only a jungle. And when people are divided, they can only be brought together by agreement, not by guns or bombs. What guns and bombs do anywhere in the world where you have a divided people, and when you look across the world at conflict, it's always about divided peoples. What does guns and bombs do? Deepen the divisions and make the problem more difficult to solve. And that was the argument that I took, and that led me straight into politics, of course. And that philosophy remained with me through 30 terrible years, when 1 out of 500 people was killed, murdered by terrorists, and 1 out of 50 was maimed or injured. That's out of a population of 1.5 million. Imagine that in percentage terms in America. That would mean that 500,000 Americans were killed and 5 million were maimed or injured. That's how serious our problem was. But thankfully, we have now ended it and got agreement for the first time in our history. And for the first time in our history, the people of our island have spoken, because we proposed, when I say we, I mean myself and my party at the talks, that the last word should be with the people and not with the politicians. And the agreement was put in a referendum, North and South in Ireland, on the one day, and the overwhelming majority in both parts of Ireland voted yes. And that undermines the minority gangsters who are still trying trouble, because they used to always claim they were acting in the name of the people. They can't do that anymore. And it's a duty now of all true democrats in Ireland to implement the will of the people.
John, one of your great achievements was to get the American government involved. And I was hoping you could share with us. One thing I noticed is that you came to Boston first. You got Tip, you got Teddy, you got them all, and then you went to Washington, and you seemed to very purposely fly over New York. Could you explain this strategy and how it began and that phone call from Teddy?
Well, I was first elected in 1969. As a young man, I stood as an independent against the leader of the Nationalist Party. And I sought a mandate to found a social democratic party, to get away from tribal politics. And that was in late 69. In early 1970, my phone rang. And it's funny, at our party congress last weekend, Ted Kennedy was on video. And he remembered, he said, I first called John in 1970 when he was a young elected person. And I said, this is Ted Kennedy. And he said to me, pull my other leg. And that's true because I didn't believe it was him, but it was him. And he said, look, I'm worried about the situation in your part of the world and I'm told I should talk to you. From that moment onwards, he kept in total contact, and his office kept in total contact, and kept fully briefed about what was happening. And Speaker Tip O'Neill did exactly the same. I'll never forget Tip coming as the first speaker ever to come to Northern Ireland. And he came down onto my streets, and we had all the official things because he was speaker. But when that was finished, I says, Tip, get into my car. You're coming somewhere special with me now. He says, where are you taking me, John? I says, I'll tell you when I take you there. I got into the car, and I drove across the border into Donegal and up a hillside. He says, where are you taking me? I says, where do we get there, Tip? And I stopped beside a ruined cottage. I says, Tip, there is the cottage in which your grandmother was born before she emigrated to America. Because he had told me earlier, you see, about Nile, I'd done a lot of research and tracked it down. And he broke down and wept. And I got out of the car with him, and I walked over and lifted a stone off the ruined wall and gave it to him. And that stone sat on his desk until he died. But he was a total friend of Ireland. Because in 1977, the first ever statement by an American president was made about Northern Ireland. Up to then, they wouldn't make it because the British government had always said you can't interfere in the internal affairs of Britain, Northern Ireland being an integral part of the United Kingdom. And the four horsemen, as they were called, Ted Kennedy, Tip O'Neill, Senator Pat Moynihan from New York, and Hugh Carey, Governor Hugh Carey, who was a congressman in those days. The four of them had worked very closely with me. And they got President Carter to make the first ever statement in 1977 in consultation with myself, saying the time has come for the British and Irish governments to work together to solve the problem of Northern Ireland. And if you do, we Americans will support you economically. Now, when you hear that today, that sounds common sense. But in those days, it sounded impossible. Because British governments wouldn't talk to Irish governments about Northern Ireland. Say, Northern Ireland's part of us, not part of you. But 8 years later, the first Anglo-Irish agreement was signed between the two governments, which was the first step in our peace process when history is written, because I know. But the day after it was signed, my phone rang to Tip O'Neill. John, we keep our promises. We said we would support you economically if we got that. We're now setting up the International Fund for Ireland. That fund, which funds the poor areas of Northern Ireland and the border counties, the areas that suffer from it all, has already created 38,000 jobs for young people in that area. And that's the sort of real support for our peace process we have got from your country. And we owe the enormous debt of gratitude to those political leaders who gave us that support. And as you also know, your President Clinton was the first president to put peace in Ireland right at the top of his agenda and to come down onto our streets as well. And we owe him a massive debt too. And of course, the link between America and Ireland is so natural. We Irish are the biggest wandering people in the world. There's 43 million Irish Americans, yet there's only 5 million Irish people.
Well, you have big families.
Yeah. Oh, we have very big families in Ireland, yeah.
Let me ask you, this is all heady stuff, but I remember in the early 90s when it emerged that you had been meeting with Gerry Adams, leader of Sinn Féin, trying to find a nationalist consensus on the way forward. Members of your own party were appalled that you were doing this.
Yes.
You were very alone then.
Mm-hmm.
I remember meeting you then, and it was the lowest I ever saw you.
Yeah.
That you were very much on your own, and that you knew you were doing the right thing, and history has judged that you did do the right thing, but at that time you were being vilified by Irish people,
Yes.
let alone what British people thought. Tell me about that. What happened then?
Well, what happened was, of course, that I was a public representative, and on our streets, human beings were losing their lives every day. And I felt it was my duty to do everything in my power to stop that. Because the reason I was in politics, which I assumed everybody else was to solve the problems of the people you represent. And I was totally and absolutely opposed to violence and the IRA. Because as I made clear repeatedly, it's the people of our island who are divided, not the territory. And guns and bombs will only deepen the divisions. But I thought also that it was my duty to do everything in my power to stop that violence. And given the 20,000 British soldiers in our streets weren't stopping it, I felt that if I could save even one life by talking to somebody, it was my duty to do so. And this was the historian in me, because I was a trained historian before I became a politician. I graduated in French language and history, and I taught both before I went into politics. But it was a historian in me knew the traditional reasons in Ireland for IRA existence. And I knew that whatever about our history, that those reasons were no longer true today. And I said so. Then I got a secret message. Would I meet them and talk to them? And I met Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams, and they said, you prove what you're saying is true and we'll stop. And what I was saying was that there are two reasons, you see, for violence, where the British are in Ireland defending their own interests by force. Therefore, we have the right to use force to put them out. And my argument was that used to be true in the past, but it's not true in today's new century. And they said, you prove that. So it ended up with me getting the British and Irish governments to make a joint statement, joint declaration. That Britain had no selfish economic or strategic interest in being in Ireland, that it was a matter for the people of Ireland, north and south, to sort out their differences. That led to the ceasefires and to the all-party talks with both governments and all parties that led to the Good Friday Agreement.
John, do you remember that day, I think it was 93, in Greysteel? Yes. That was that period. I remember I was at that funeral. And you remember that woman came up to you?
Yeah.
Tell that story.
Greysteel is a village outside my city. And in those days, the paramilitaries from the Protestant side, the Loyalists, went into a bar, a local small bar in a village, and shot people dead.
It was Halloween.
Around Halloween, yeah. And I was at the funerals, because they were in my district, and I was a member of Parliament. And when we come out after they were buried, this young child walked up to me, and she put her arms around me. Now, at that time, I was talking to Gerry Adams to get the violence stopped, but I was getting abuse from all sorts of quarters that I shouldn't be talking to these people. This young girl came up and put her arms around me and says, Mr. Hume, we prayed for you last night around my daddy's coffin. And we prayed that you would be successful in your talks so that nobody else will ever suffer what we have just suffered. Now just imagine that. I broke down and wept. There's television pictures of me doing it, actually. And that proved to me the feelings of ordinary people, that they didn't want to live. And think of the strength of that family. They weren't looking for revenge in any shape or form, because they knew what death means. And of course that strengthened my fundamental principle. And the principles, and this is something I say very often, by the way, no matter where conflict exists, anywhere in the world, it's all about the same thing. It's about difference. Whether difference is your religion, or your nationality, or your race. And the answer to difference is to respect it, not to fight about it. Now, I'm talking very simple language now, but just think of it. Are there two people in this auditorium who are the same? Are there two people in the entire human race who are the same? Difference is of the essence of humanity. Yet also, did any one of you choose to be born? Did you choose to be born into a particular religion, a particular nationality, or a particular race? Of course not. It's an accident of birth what we're born and where we're born. Therefore, it's not something we should fight about. It's something we should respect. Now, I'm talking very normal common sense. But that's common sense that needs to be talked in areas of conflict very often. It's so true. And I found talking that on the ground to people, I would say to people who would be on one extreme side, by the way, if you'd been born on the other side, would you be shooting your own side? And they stop and look, oh God, what do you mean? I said, just think about it. And it's a very important principle of peace, respect for difference. And as you said earlier on, or when I was being introduced, I learned a very great lesson of peace when I was first elected to the European Parliament in 1979. And it's a story I always tell because it's so powerful. When I arrived in Strasbourg in France for the first meetings of the new Parliament, I went for a walk to see where I was. And I walked across the bridge from Strasbourg, which is on the French border with Germany. And the bridge goes over to a town called Kiel in Germany. And I walked across it and I stopped in the middle of the bridge. And I stopped and I meditated. And I said, good Lord, if I had stood in this bridge 30 years ago, 1949, just after the Second World War, when 35 million people were dead, slaughtered, for the second time in a century, the worst in the history of the world, 2 world wars in one half of a century. If I had said, don't worry, in 30 years' time, it'll be all over. You'll never be fighting again. And you'll be all in a united Europe. I thought, good Lord, if I'd said that 30 years ago, they'd have sent me to a psychiatrist. But it happened. And therefore I thought it's the duty of everybody to study how it happened. And I did study it. And if you look at the principles at the heart of the European Union, you'll find they're the same principles at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. Principle number 1. And think of these now and apply them to the Middle East. And apply them to the Basque Country or to any areas where divided peoples are fighting with one another. Principle number 1, respect for difference. No victory for either side. Respect one another. Principle number 2, institutions which respect those differences. In Europe, there are institutions where a council of ministers, a minister from every country, large and small, and their decisions were by agreement, not by majorities, so that it was total respect for all. Backed up by a European Commission, which is a civil service from all of the European countries, and a European Parliament, which is elected by all the European countries. And the third principle, which in my opinion is the most important, was that they then worked together, the representative of all those countries, in their common interests, areas of agreement, not disagreement, economic development. In other words, they spilt their sweat and not their blood. And as they did that, they broke down the barriers of centuries. And the new Europe has evolved and is still evolving. Now, those are the exact same 3 principles at the heart of our agreement in Ireland. Number 1, respect for difference. No victory for either community. the identities of both our peoples, Protestant and Catholic, are fully respected. Institutions, number 2, which respect those differences. An assembly elected by a system of proportional voting, which ensures that all sections of the people are represented. And then that assembly proportionally elects the government. No majority rule nonsense, proportional. So that all sections of the people are represented in government. And that's now in place, those institutions. And now the third principle starts, which is the most important of all, the healing, what I call the healing process. Because when you have a divided people, you don't heal their divisions in a week or a fortnight. You require a healing process. Once the representatives of our people now, as they have started working together, spilling their sweat and not their blood, a new Ireland will evolve, and the barriers will break down by the trust that they will build by working together and knowing one another, rather than living apart and shouting at one another. And the new Ireland, as I say, will evolve in a generation or two, but it will be based on agreement and respect for difference. And that's a real philosophy of peace, which I think it's our duty to take to every region in the world that is suffering from this. And my hope and dream, of course, is that the new century and the new millennium, given in particular that in this new century where we are all sitting now, a new millennium, we are also living through the biggest revolution in the history of the world, the technological telecommunications and transport revolution. The world today is a much smaller place because of all of that. Just think of your grandparents, the world that they lived in. Would they have been as close together to other countries? But that being the case, then our dream of a world without war and without conflict should be easier to make because we are more conscious of our common humanity and our differences. And that's why it's a great and terrible regret of the terrible atrocities of New York and Washington last month, or the month in September the 11th.
Where were you, John, when that happened?
When that happened, I was at home in Ireland, and I couldn't believe it. And of course, as you're probably aware, right across Europe, and I was in the European Parliament when the subject came up, there's total sympathy with the American people and total support for the American government and the democratic countries of the world working together to bring to justice the people who committed those terrible atrocities. But we all hope that in doing that innocent people will not suffer. Because, as nobody is more aware than you people in America, the people of Afghanistan as a whole are as much the victims of these so-called rulers as anybody else. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't studied Afghanistan up until that. I started reading about it. Imagine a country where women are not allowed to go to school.
And drive.
85% of the women of Afghanistan can't read or write because they're not allowed to go to school because they're women. And 70% of the people are undernourished. And 1 million died in their wars of the last 20 years. And 6 million of them are refugees. Therefore, and I have no doubt America will do this because I know that the American people are sending humanitarian aid into them, that when this crowd who started this are brought to justice, that real help can be given to the Afghanistan people to become a normal society, and the best help that can be given is education, because the only wealth any country has is people. Without people, any country is only a jungle. And the more that people are equipped by education, the more they will develop their own countries.
John,
And I think that's one of the great new challenges that we now face, to build a new century and a new millennium without war and conflict, but where we have people all over the world respecting one another and building the new world together.
last month the IRA agreed and began disarming,
Yeah.
which sort of was the culmination of your grand vision. when you started talking to people like me and others 20 years ago about it, we kind of laughed at you and said, John's a little barmy. But it's begun to happen. I'm curious how much you think September 11th had to do with the timing of the IRA's gesture. It seemed like it was inevitable that the IRA would begin to disarm, but they were holding on, How much of what happened on September 11th affected that, in your view?
Well, of course, what September the 11th brought across to the whole world was the real meaning of terrorism. The terrorists were people who, without any mandate of any description, killed other human beings. And, as I say, it's one of the, well, from our experience on the ground, we've seen it as well, that it's just terrible when you have people like that. But we had already achieved in Ireland, before September the 11th, since '94, we had got to the stage where the paramilitary organisations had declared that their violence, the IRA in particular, that their violence was stopped. And then, of course, there was pressure on them, prove that it stopped by handing over your guns. Now, from that was first mentioned, my opinion was the most important thing when a paramilitary organisation or a terrorist organisation declares that it has stopped its violence, what is important is, are they telling the truth? Not have they handed over their guns. Because, as I've often said, you can hand over guns on Monday and secretly buy more on Tuesday. What's important is when you say you've stopped, are you telling the truth? And of course I believe that when the IRA declared their ceasefire that they did mean it, because I had been in direct dialogue with them. And even though they were my political enemies, and I knew that, but I believe that they have stopped. But given the pressure for that, I thought that the best way of that being achieved, proving that their guns were beyond use, wasn't asking them to hand over their guns to a British government, because that would have been seen as surrender, and that couldn't happen psychologically. An independent body was set up, an independent body of expert military people, headed by General de Chastelain from Canada. And we owe them a great debt as well, because of their patience, the amount of time they have spent living on our streets. And the way to prove that these guns were finished was for the paramilitaries to meet with General de Chastelain and demonstrate to him that their weapons were beyond use. And that is now happening. And that's very welcome. But naturally, my hope and dream is, of course, that violence is over. Because for 300 years in our part of the world, it's the longest quarrel in the world. Our quarrel started in my city in 1689, the Siege of Derry. And it's been going on ever since. But hopefully we have now brought it to an end, so that all the talents of our people will be used, as I say, in spilling their sweat, not their blood, and using their talents to build a country rather than to destroy it. And perhaps in the new century as well, it'll be the first century that we have in Ireland where young people don't have to go to another land to earn a living.
Over your political career, you've interacted with some of the more famous and infamous politicians in Britain, Ireland, and America. I'd like to throw some names out at you and just ask if you could give us a short summary of them as politicians, but also as people. And I will begin with Margaret Thatcher.
Well, we called her Maggie Thatcher, but... Well, I have to be honest. She had a reputation of being this and that, and of being to the right of Genghis Khan and all that, But I went to talk to her about the Northern Ireland situation directly. And I discovered, as I always guessed, that like many other British politicians, she knew nothing about Northern Ireland. And they never did. All they ever said, since Northern Ireland was founded in 1920, all they ever said is Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, therefore. And I said to her at that meeting, you keep telling us that as long as Northern Ireland is as long as a majority of people want Northern Ireland to be an integral part of the United Kingdom, that is your policy, that they will remain. I says, what happens if a majority wants to be part of United Ireland? She looked at me. She says, what? I said, suppose a majority decides something different. Would you vote for that? And she looked around at her advisors. And she said, leave that with me. And I then afterwards talked privately to some of her advisors who, I'm talking about civil servants now, who were very good people in my opinion. But shortly afterwards, when the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed, Article 1C said, if the majority of people in Northern Ireland want Irish unity, we will legislate for it. I immediately come out with a statement welcoming the Anglo-Irish Agreement and saying the British have now declared their neutrality on the future of Ireland, and therefore they have removed the traditional reasons for violence given by the IRA. Therefore they should stop. And that led to a secret message to me. Would I go and meet the IRA? Which I did. And they said, you prove what you're saying. And that's how that happened. And it was Margaret Thatcher that did it, in spite of all the image she has.
Good on you, Maggie.
The first step on the road to peace. Thank you, Maggie.
Charlie Haughey.
Yes?
Yes, what?
Well,
The great Republican.
Well, when my dialogue with Gerry Adams started, Charlie Haughey was the Taoiseach, and John Major was the British Prime Minister. And I was engaged in secret talks, private talks with Gerry Adams, because I thought the talks should be private. Later on, he was seen going into my house one day by a neighbour who immediately gave it to the press, and then it was plastered all over the papers, and I was attacked by everybody. But before that, when our talks were going on privately, I fully informed John Major, the British Prime Minister, and Charlie Haughey, the Irish Taoiseach and Prime Minister, that these talks were going on, and that the objective of these talks was a joint statement from both of them, making clear that what I was saying was true, that Britain had no interest, and that it would be for the two governments to bring the people of Ireland together. And I kept both informed, and Charlie Haughey worked very closely with me, because as I would give Gerry Adams the proposed declaration, he would go and consult with all his colleagues and come back with his amended version. And then I would discuss that with Charlie Haughey, and they would then come back with theirs. And that went on for months until we finally got it agreed. And we finally got it agreed the week that Charlie resigned as Taoiseach. But he fully briefed his successor, Albert Reynolds. And Albert went straight out and said his primary objective was peace in the north. And that's what happened. So I have to say, in spite of all the criticism that he's received, that in working for peace in the north, he was right up front. And I thank him for it.
George Mitchell told me that if John Major had a majority in the Parliament, he would have delivered years earlier than what was delivered. Do you accept that?
There's no doubt whatsoever. If John Major had had a majority at the time, he would certainly have. His problem was that in order to retain government, he was relying on people he was relying on unionist votes and extreme right wings in his own party. So if he produced a joint statement with the Irish government that got the IRA to stop, he would have had some of his own colleagues voting against him and he would have been put out of office. So that's what slowed the thing up at the time, and there's no doubt about that. But John Major, I have to say, worked very closely with me and was very committed to achieving peace in our streets.
Tony Blair.
Tony Blair, of course, I have to say, and I'm sure you people in America would recognise it about him as well, and the support that he has given to your government in the recent atrocities. Tony Blair put peace in Northern Ireland right at the top of his agenda in a way that no British Prime Minister ever did before, in spite of the long nature of the Irish problem. Tony Blair put peace right at the top of his agenda, and he has worked and worked and worked and worked. And every time a difficulty comes up, it gets his priority. And I totally expressed gratitude to him for the fact, because apart from John Major and himself, previous prime ministers never did anything about what was happening in Northern Ireland. But we owe a great debt to Tony Blair.
Gerry Adams.
And Gerry Adams, as I say, when we met, we met very often privately in in-depth discussion. And of course my approach was demanding a complete change of attitude by them, because my argument was that the traditional attitudes of the IRA and violence would not solve our problem. We're only making it worse, therefore they had to stop. In other words, I was asking them to admit privately that they were wrong in what they were doing. And that if I got and he said, well, if you can prove what you're saying is true, we'll stop. Get the British government to say it, which is what happened. And he then provided the necessary leadership within his own organisation, because it's rather different. Leading a political party and leading paramilitarism is different things, because when you're changing policy with a political party, you call a meeting of the members and you have a debate and you have a vote, and that's it. But if it's paramilitary organisations, you don't call a meeting, because if quite a few are against you, they know all who they are, and they can go and form another army. So the way to do it is to go around them one by one.
Did Gerry Adams ever tell you he thinks they were wrong?
That takes time. No, Gerry Adams, throughout my dialogue with him, was very clear to me that he was totally committed to the process working.
Remember Sean O'Callaghan, the IRA informer? He said that in a meeting in the mid-'80s, I believe, he suggested that Gerry Adams once suggested that maybe the IRA should kill you. Do you believe that happened?
That maybe the IRA should kill me?
Yeah.
Well, there were several attempts to kill me. I mean, I live in the middle of the Bogside, myself, my wife Pat, and our family. And of course, they had made various efforts to drive us out. There was a very serious attack on my home one day, and I was down in Waterford, and they firebombed my home. I heard it on the news suddenly when I was coming out of a meeting, and Pat and my youngest daughter were in the house at the time, and they were very lucky to escape with their lives. They got out the back gate quickly when the IRA firebombed my home. And they also, on other occasions, tried to kill me by different methods. But as I say, I was a historian and I understood what gave birth to all of this in my country. And I worked to deal with the underlying reasons and to prove to them that these underlying reasons, whatever about previous centuries, didn't exist in this century. And that was the strategy that I was pursuing. And thankfully, to date, it seems to have worked.
You and David Trimble shared the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
But I don't get the sense that you guys have each other over for barbecues in the backyard. What's he like as a politician and as a person?
Well, my view is, of course, when you grow up in a community like ours, you understand, if you apply your mind to it, you understand the mentalities of both communities. And of course, to lead the unionist community away from its past attitude, which was, as I said earlier, to hold all power in their own hands, wasn't easy. Particularly if your main opponent is a man called Ian Paisley, you know. I once said to him, Ian, if you took the word no out of the English language, you would be speechless. and he said, no, I wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't.
But as I say, I understand David's problems in leading his people forward, because they have what I call a siege mentality. They see the rest of Ireland as being against their interests. So every proposal you put to unionists, particularly Ian Paisley, they tend to always look for what's wrong with it, not for what's right with it. Now, as we all know, this world is not perfect. My attitude when a proposal is put is to take the positive and build on it and make progress. But they always look at what's wrong with it. And I've said to Paisley repeatedly, Ian, you're against this. Tell me what your alternative is. We've never heard one yet. You know? It's just,
what about Trimble, this person?
well, as I say, Trimble obviously has been trying to lead them away from their past attitudes into the new ball game. And it's been very difficult for him. But as I say, in our situation, if you come out and say you sympathise with him, all you're doing is weakening him. If one side's saying you sympathise with,
right.
you know, I think he has been working very hard to deliver the agreement that he signed with the rest of us, and I hope he will be successful. And it's looking now that our institutions are back in place, my hope is now that what I called earlier principle number 3, the healing process, is now in place, working together to build a new society together.
Last time I checked, there wasn't a big Irish vote in Arkansas, yet Bill Clinton just seemed to take this to heart. And I know that when I had a conversation with him about this, he said that John Hume was the big salesman on this. He really got me going on it. How did you get Bill Clinton to put this at the top of his foreign policy agenda with the Middle East, Haiti? It was up there. I don't think Americans recognized how much time the president and the National Security Staff, Nancy Soderberg, put them in. How did you get them interested?
Well, Bill Clinton, I mean, I got by sheer good chance to meet presidents of the United States directly and personally, and I was able to talk to them about our problem. And how that happened was, of course, I remember saying to Tip O'Neill, as you probably gathered earlier, Tip and I became close friends. I said, Tip, why is it that Washington is the only major city in America that does nothing on St. Patrick's Day? He says, oh God, you're right, John, leave that with me. And then I get a phone call sometime later, John, I'm starting something on St. Patrick's Day. I says, what is it, Speaker? I'm setting up a lunch in your honour, he says. Oh, I thought he was pulling my leg, but he invited me to a lunch on St. Patrick's Day, and I goes to the lunch. And leading members of the Senate and Congress are at the lunch, and in comes President Reagan. And I thought, oh great, but where does Tip put me? Beside himself. And on the other side of me is President Reagan. But from that moment onwards, I was meeting presidents directly, and I met Bill Clinton directly. And he was very interested in our situation in Northern Ireland. And to be honest, from the beginning, he worked very hard to encourage the two governments to work together and to promote peace. But I think it was also very valuable that his main advisor was a lady called Nancy Soderberg. And if you don't know who Nancy was Ted Kennedy's advisor for many years before Bill Clinton became president. And then she went to work. But Nancy was a total expert on what was happening in Northern Ireland, and therefore was able to give him very correct and detailed advice on what was happening. And I think that was a major factor. And of course, and I admit this in politics, and I admit it in my own politics, there's not a single politician that would be who they are if it weren't for the strong support they get from their own advisors and the people that work for them. I mean, for example, my wife's sitting here. I would be out at meetings making public speeches. She'd be running the office in the city, dealing with the people every day and dealing with their day-to-day problems of housing and unemployment and all the rest of it, whereas I'd be only away making speeches. But the real work was being done on the ground.
She's vastly underpaid.
And that's
Do you have some
it.
questions, David? Oh, here we go. Thank you, Robert.
I hope I haven't been boring you all.
No. We obviously have an informed audience here because this first question is right on the money. What's the future of your party, the SDLP, in your absence and with the rise and popularity of Sinn Féin?
Well, I think, first of all, that I have no doubt about the strength of our party. The last election, the media reported that our vote was falling and the Sinn Féin vote was rising. The facts are, when you look at the actual vote, that our vote did not fall. Our vote was exactly the same as it was in the previous election, 177,000 votes or something like that. Sinn Féin's vote rose. My reading of that was that people were voting for them at the time because they thought that that was encouraging them in the peace process. But the ordinary people on the ground know that throughout the last 30 years, we were the party that was totally consistent. Who was the party that was totally against violence? The SDLP. So Sinn Féin have now admitted that we were right and they were wrong, because they've stopped the violence. And who was the party that said that to solve the problem, you had to address three sets of relationships that go to the heart of the Irish problem? Relations within Northern Ireland, within Ireland, between Britain and Ireland, the SDLP. What was the agenda at the talks leading to the Good Friday Agreement? Those three sets of relationships. Who was the party that said that the future could not be just a single Ireland at the present time? It had to be power sharing between both communities within the North and a North-South relationship. The SDLP. And that's what happened. And who was the party that said that the last word should be with the people when an agreement was reached and not with the politicians, and proposed a joint referendum? We in the SDLP. The people know that, and that Sinn Féin are now adopting our policies. That's what's happening in practice. So as we now move forward, the people know that. And I have no doubt that the majority of people who stood shoulder to shoulder with us through the difficult years of violence will certainly do so now as we build a new Ireland together.
Do you think there should be a complete separation of church and state in Northern Ireland, specifically referring to schools, which folks don't know, over 95% of children in Northern Ireland go to schools that are either Catholic or state schools, in effect Protestant schools?
Well, of course, it's very easy to point to that now and say it, but when you look at the nature of our past, that's a fairly natural development, because when you consider that from Northern Ireland was founded until the civil rights movement, unionist governments who controlled housing made sure that Protestants all lived in one district and Catholics lived in another, and that affected their voting rights and all the rest of it. And that being the case, most districts in Northern Ireland are still Protestant or Catholic. Therefore, the schools in those districts are naturally one or the other as well. So to change that is going to take time. But there is a new mood. And at university level now, there's obviously people from all sections of the community are together. And there's a greater contact between schools from the different sides, meeting regularly on different matters. And as we evolve, I think that change in education in that sense will evolve as well. But given today's modern world, I think that, education, because of the smaller world, education is more looking outwards now than looking inwards. And as I say, as I have often said, given that Northern Ireland is part of United Europe, if both sections of our community are working with French and Germans and Italians and Spaniards at European level, and those are countries that have a lot more difference with us than we have with one another, then why can't we work together at our own level? And that's happening. Ian Paisley and I work very closely together at European level, because we are two of the MEPs and members of the European Parliament. Actually, could I tell you a funny story, and it's a true story?
It's about Ian Paisley. Can't be that funny.
Yeah. Well, it's about Ian Paisley, and it is very funny, actually. One day in the last European Parliament, the late Brian Lenihan, who was the Irish Foreign Minister and a very good man, was out in the European Parliament to answer questions because Ireland had the presidency of Europe at the time. And Brian was having a drink with me in the bar of the European Parliament. And we were drinking a glass of the local wine. And in comes Ian Paisley, who doesn't drink. But he didn't know Brian, or he wouldn't have come up to be seen with an Irish Republican minister, you see. And he says to me, I see you're at the devil's buttermilk again today, Hume. The wine. It'll be the ruination you get. I says, come here a minute, Ian. I want you to meet a real live Irish Republican. And a Fianna Fáil one at that, and he's your president at the moment. So he stopped and says, glad to know you, sir. Wonder you wouldn't get Hume off the devil's buttermilk. And I says, Brian, what Ian really means is, when are you going to buy him a drink? And Brian says, would you like a drink, Dr. Paisley? Not at all. I'll never touch this stuff. But on second thoughts, since it's you that's buying, I'll have an orange and a bitter one at that. So up comes the orange. Up comes the orange, and Paisley says, look, Hume, you always get the last word. Look what they gave me, Joker Orange. That was the name of the orange. So, like, in spite of all our differences, we still are human at personal level. We meet regularly in the one parliament, you know, and occasionally we talk to one another.
Excuse me. The IRA has begun to disarm. When will the UDA and the UDF, I think they mean the UVF, will decommission their arms?
That's a very good question, and a very, very timely question, actually, because all of the publicity in recent times, as you probably are aware, was about IRA decommissioning and getting rid of their arms. And there was no concentration on the loyalist, unionist paramilitary organisations. And there's no evidence as of yet that they are decommissioning. But the pressure is there now, given that the IRA are doing it, on them to do the same thing.
Do you think it'll happen?
Well, I hope it will. There are minority elements within, you know, the terrible situation with those young children who are being stopped from going to school in Ardoyne. What's happening there isn't political. There's paramilitary elements are trying to stir up sectarianism again because they don't want law and order to be restored, because they're actually a mafia. They're engaged in the drug trade and they're making a fortune out of it. And they don't want law and order in the streets. And that's now well known among the community. And there's strong community opposition to what they're doing. And naturally, I hope that will get it stopped sooner rather than later.
Well, we're going to wrap up here now. Appreciate everybody coming out. And I'm going to give the last word, as usual, to Mr. Hume. And had a great time. We should do this in Derry.
Yeah. Actually, I'm glad he mentioned Derry, because
here we go.
Let me tell you about it. I'm first and foremost a Derry man. After that, I'm an Irishman. And after that, I'm a European. And I'm no less a Derry man because I'm an Irishman, and I'm no less an Irishman because I'm a European. But my city is very proud of its links with your country. In the days of the sailing ship, it was the port of biggest emigration to America. And when you look at the 19th century, the best known song to come out of Ireland was known as the Derry Air, or depending which side you were on, the London Derry Air. Danny Boy. But many people don't listen to the words of that. And if you're of Irish descent, think of your ancestry that left Ireland to come here. The words of that song, if you listen to it, is a mother saying farewell to her son who's leaving to go to America, knowing that she will never see him again in the days of the sailing ship, that he could never come back. And that shows where our link started. Then, as I say, in the days of the sailing ship, it was the port of greatest emigration. But in the Second World War, my city was the European headquarters of the American Navy. And the German U-boats surrendered to them in our bay. When I was a child growing up, in one of the poorer areas of our city, the bottom of our street was a field where the American Navy played baseball. And I learned to be a baseball player. And the field next is where they lived, in Nissen huts, called Springtown Camp. And when they left, after the war, the housing was so bad that people went in and lived in their Nissen huts. And it was terrible housing conditions for families. But when we got that solved, today, that Springtown Camp is an American industrial zone. And our city now is the European headquarters of DuPont, Fruit of the Loom, Seagate, Stream International, Raytheon. And, as I say, American investment in our part of the world is a major factor in providing peace and stability, because it's giving real hope to young people that they can at last earn a living in the land of their birth. And to renew the links with the American Navy, I recently invited the Marines leadership of the present United States to come back to my city. And I took the captains, I took them to the house where the captains lived. The ordinary sailors lived in the Nissen huts, but the captains lived in a big house, which is now a hotel. And I brought them back to there some months ago, and they couldn't believe it. And we unveiled a memorial to them for being there in the Second World War. And I also invited over the Leathernecks Marine Band, because the Marine Band, given the music in our derriere, the city of Danny Boy, the Leatherneck Band of the United States Marines was founded in 1942 in my city during the Second World War, outside, and they played for the first time outside our city hall. I invited them back, and a couple of months ago they came back and played again outside our city hall. And when you think of the history of that, one of the people who did come back had been one of the captains during the Second World War, and he was 90 years old. And he said, "I want to tell you something, young man," he said to me. "If we hadn't been in your city, our Navy, the Second World War would have lasted 2 years longer." Because while the American Navy were in our part of Ireland, the rest of Ireland in those days said they were neutral and wouldn't get involved. But Northern Ireland, the American Navy based themselves, because the fear was that the Germans would come at Britain and France through the back door of Ireland. But the American Navy stopped that happening. And of course, hundreds of them, because they were, not just because they were Americans, but because they were men, married local women. And I think that's a huge historic link that has been forgotten, but I'm working to rebuild it. And I'm very selfish in rebuilding, because I want to promote American tourism into my area and American investment, so that we can have the first ever Ireland where we don't have to, where our young people don't have to emigrate to earn a living. And there's no doubt that our great friends in that regard are the American people.
John, this was fun. Let's go have a jar. That was on the listen. I don't know. I didn't want. There was a question to actually do that. I didn't want to do that if you didn't want to do it. I don't know. I think David's going to say something.
John, Kevin, thank you so much for bringing a piece of the world to us here in Pasadena, and for bringing yourself, a man whose courage and whose sensitivity has allowed him to play this remarkable role in bringing historic divisions to an end and bringing hope to an area that for many of us seemed hopeless for such a very long time. We are proud to have the opportunity to have you here at Caltech. We want to give you a little remembrance of this day. Actually, it's not so little. And I didn't even want to pick it up, so it's sitting here. It's it has Lee DuBridge's head here on a beautiful piece of glass. Watch out, it's just kind of sitting there. Yeah. Lee DuBridge was a great man. I hope that you will enjoy having his image as part of your collection of the many, many honors that you have gotten all around the world, of course, the greatest of which is the Nobel Peace Prize.
Thank you very much. And
I have one other thing. I also want to recognize your wife for the very important role that she played in bringing the crusade that you've given your life to and that she's given her life to the success that it has had. Would you please come and join John? We have a good
Thank you.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome.
could I thank you very much for having myself and Pat here this evening, and thank you all for coming, because what your very presence tells me very clearly is your total concern and sympathy for our situation and your total support for our peace process. Thank you very much, and that strengthens our will to make sure that we at last have lasting peace and stability on our offshore island. Thank you very much.